Okay, Eric, ready? Presentation number 4. The PI is Eric Waltenberg, and the topic is a relational-based measure of state legislator consequence.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Understudied and overshadowed by the attention given to the actions of the U.S. Congress, the policy choices pursued and made in state legislatures are hugely important. In the aggregate, states both introduce and enact more policies than does the Congress. Indeed, in many respects, the states are where the action is in terms of shaping and pursuing policy. For example, after the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Agreement, a bipartisan group of states announced that they would continue to pursue policies that followed the agreement's goals. Recently, states have been given the nod to actively seek waivers to experiment with welfare reform. To put it simply, the choices these subnational actors make have profound consequences. Yet, there is no systematic method to make predictions or forecasts as to the likelihood these subnational choices are ultimately enacted. In our proposal, we ask what explains, or better actually predicts, variation among the states in the creation and implementation of their policies. And there is variation. Consider differences across the states concerning minimum wage regulations, or healthcare policy, or energy efficiency standards, or even regulations concerning automated vehicles. Wouldn't policy activists, entrepreneurs, journalists, organized interests, and other citizens like to know what the forecast is for a bill concerning automated vehicle regulations the next time it appears in Indiana? Our proposal aims to produce a model that provides just such a forecast. It leverages data science techniques to predict legislative outcomes that are tailored to the specific state. Traditional analyses of political behavior have focused on explaining outcomes rather than predicting them. And forecasting models of state legislatures are non-existent, in no small part because they are frustrated by the enormity and complexity of the data required to the task. Our proposal builds a forecasting model that predicts the outcome of legislation in any given state. To do so, it requires the identification and measurement of pivotal or consequential legislators across the states, and the identification of legislator stances or revealed preferences on pending legislation. The approach taken to build this model entails an innovative application of data science and linguistic analysis to political science and policy studies. The forecasts are made on the basis of the huge amounts of data that are associated with a bill's passage. These data involve traditional voting relationships as well as data derived from linguistic analysis of texts. Both bodies of data will be used to identify and measure the consequence scores for legislators and as inputs for the prediction concerning a given piece of legislation's likely outcome. Constructing the model involves a novel partnership between political science and computer science. I have some expertise in the areas of political science, in state politics and state legislative behavior, and will supervise the computation and analysis of the consequence scores. The scores themselves measure the degree to which a legislator's revealed preference on a bill improves the prediction regarding the bill's final outcome. Does it pass or fail, simply put? The most pivotal or consequential legislator in any given assembly, then, is a legislator whose preference, once revealed, has the greatest impact on the ability to accurately predict the final roll call vote. This is determined with a pair of relational matrices derived from known voting outcomes. One matrix allows initial predictions to be set, and the second matrix will allow a determination of how a given legislator's revealed preference, in this case his or her actual vote, ripples through the voting relationships in the full chamber so that a prediction of the final vote can be made. Consequence scores are measures of the effect a legislator's revealed preference has on the improvement in the predictive accuracy of the chamber's final vote over the initial naive prediction. After thousands of runs where each legislator is compared to every other legislator, the legislator with the greatest overall impact on the prediction's accuracy has the highest score, is identified as a pivotal legislator. Professor Dan Goldwasser, an expert on applied machine learning and natural language processing problems, will supervise the model's linguistic analysis component. Dr. Goldwasser is especially well suited for this project. He has several research publications on large-scale analyses of political discourse data. The linguistic analysis will use a weakly supervised method to measure legislative stance and agreement or disagreement using social and behavioral information communicated through social media. The use of Twitter data will permit the identification of legislators' stance and issue frames in what is effectively near real time, which will enable on-demand forecasting. Take as an example a couple of tweets from Indiana legislators that linguistic analysis identifies as relevant to the legislator's stance on a needle exchange program. The classification of these tweets effectively reveal the legislator's preferences on the pending legislation, and a forecast concerning the bill's outcome could be made. In other words, the classified tweets would be used as revealed preference inputs that then ripple through the relational matrix to compute a prediction for the needle exchange legislation. The linguistic analysis will also be able to identify other textual indicators that are related to a bill's passage. Their measurement will allow the forecast to be tuned to different textual and subject area contexts. Being able to derive forecasts that are sensitive to state contexts is one of the proposal's primary benefits. The forecasting model will also replace specialized insider knowledge concerning the dynamics of legislative outcomes with a data-driven understanding of state legislative behavior. And finally, in the process of producing a forecasting model, the proposal will yield a database that will be useful to the fields of public policy, political science, and communications. There are several measures and/or databases relevant to legislative behavior. None, however, provide the quality of information on forces relevant to state legislative policymaking that our proposal promises to do. Nor do they consider variation across issue frames, policy areas, or the capacity to provide on-demand and near real-time forecasts of legislative outcomes. The proposal leverages Purdue's strengths in computer science and unstructured data analytics. It provides a catalyst for the development of analytical tools useful to the study of state legislative behavior. It expands on Purdue's already significant presence as a repository of data on American legislatures. And given the speed with which estimates of legislative outcomes can be produced, Purdue will become a primary source for forecasts and information about state legislative pursuits, in a manner similar to, say, 538's role in predicting presidential electoral outcomes. This last point in particular might be entrepreneurially leveraged to produce revenue so the forecasting model can become self-sufficient. Both our budget and milestones are organized so as to produce a working forecasting model within 18 months. The final set of milestones include establishing the database's online presence and submitting grant proposals to relevant funding entities to secure ongoing external funding. We envision that information and forecast outputs from the measurement will be of use to interested publics, journalists, citizens, and the like. Thus, forecasts might be contracted by these actors, which could provide another source of revenue. Thank you.
I got a very naive question for you. When I'm driving, I'm listening to the radio these days all the time. And I hear the cacophony of issues going on in politics at the national level. I honestly don't pay attention to Indiana politics, but okay, be that as it may. At the national level, right? And what occurs to me as I'm listening to you is, God, there is so much that goes into a piece of legislation passing or not passing. And how much of that does really have anything to do with the particular thinking of a legislator versus other deals that have nothing to do with the legislation per se, but are happening, completely on another side? How do you factor all those complexities into this?
Well, we'll try to.
Complexity of politics, right? Which
Sure.
has nothing to do with legislator A, B, or C wanting to do C, D, or E, right? It has to do with a very complex web of particular interest at that particular moment in time, just before they go to vote.
Well, we'll try to factor those forces in a number of ways. Partly it will stem from our ability to assess how individual legislators or given legislators are likely to position themselves with respect to a piece of pending legislation, as say they're communicating through their Twitter feeds, perhaps when they're meeting with their constituents, if a newspaper reports a story on a response to that. It'll be partly based upon their prior their prior stances on similar or related issues. It's also possible that we can collect data, text data, linguistic analysis data on other relevant interested publics like organized interests, the governor's office, and the like. So on the one hand, our measure is focusing largely on the revealed preferences of individual legislators who ultimately do have to make a decision with respect to whether they're going to vote yes or no on a piece of legislation. But it's going to be capable of assessing the broader political context. That's what I was trying to get at in terms of being tailored for state-specific context with respect to the analysis of the text in the bill, the text of other aspects that will let us get a better sense as to how this given nature of legislation, say in Indiana, what might be going on with respect to a similar piece of legislation in Ohio versus a similar piece of legislation removed all the way out to California. In fact, one of the more interesting things is that it's not unusual for any number of reasons for very similar pieces of legislation to hit state legislatures at roughly the same time. And one of the really fascinating analytical questions is why they might be successful in one state or set of states and why they might not be successful in another state or set of states. And it doesn't simply boil down to whether this group of states are blue states and this group of states are red states. There's a lot more going on than simply that, and our detailed relational measures, along with all the linguistic analysis data that we can bring into our assessment, will get at those different aspects.
Can I just finish? I mean, tell me if you do this, okay? A very simple question, okay? About a week ago, Senator Rand Paul was adamant until the very last second that he was not going to vote for Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State. And he tweeted, and he spoke, and he talked about how he was against the vote. Now, the vote came to the floor of the Senate, and he voted for Mike Pompeo. Could your algorithm predict that?
Probably not. Probably not his last. Probably not on his last-minute choice.
So, you mentioned 538 and the success they had in predicting the national election, because so I'm just curious about your thoughts on what it is that the approach that they took, how that performed far better than the long-standing pundits, and whether that holds a lesson in this setting. What are the signals that you expect to be seeing here that are more reliable, perhaps, than what is currently used? And are those signals and the type of data that are important in identifying those signals going to be available to you? I think sort of goes to Tomas's question to some point, in some way as well, that maybe someone might take a stance for a long period of time and then switch at the last end. But maybe the data analysis can pick that up. There's a pattern, maybe not. But could you comment on your ability possibly?
Well, I think Dan might want to say something briefly.
I think one thing that you can say. Oh, sure. Okay. Is it on?
Yeah, we're recording it, so please.
So one of the things you can say is that regardless of what politicians say, they're going to act in a way that suits their interests. So despite the fact that Ron Paul might have said one thing, you might have said they have a record of voting with the party line, so our model will factor that in as part of the inputs, right? So when you talk this is at the national level. At the state level, you can.
Hand your microphone, please. They're recording it. Thanks.
At a state level, you can also try and factor in the specific demographics and economic factors that matter for each one of those representatives, right? So it's not just a matter of all Democrats and all Republicans voting the same way, but rather the economic interest of a specific region might come into play, right? And we want to model both the economic factors, the demographic factors, the political preferences, ideologies, and so on, and how they're expressed through their use of social media.
I have a question over here. I wonder, you mentioned sort of the interstate correlation or predictive power, perhaps, looking at sort of a wave of how an issue maybe moves through different state legislatures. Is that something you do plan to address, and could that be perhaps the most transformational application of this, since some of the issues that are important to the nation do sort of have this evolutionary aspect across the states?
I do think that, I shouldn't say think, yes, we do plan eventually on addressing that sort of a question. As the as the model itself is more fully informed and fully constructed. The way the milestones are set up is that the model is effectively built and tested over sets of states. So by the time the model is completed, it will be running and operational for all 50 states. At that point in time, yeah, then it becomes possible to in fact look at how waves of legislation succeed or not with respect to different variations across the different states. So that could be the most transformational aspect to this thing. As I said, as I tried to say at the start of the presentation, in many respects, the states are where the real policy creation action is right now. If for another reason, then there's so much gridlock that happens to be going on in Washington. So with that, policy entrepreneurs, organized interests, policy activists are turning with greater attention to the states to try to accomplish their ends there. And it might be very interesting to try and understand and for that matter, predict what their likely success or failure is going to be, depending on where they strategically locate their efforts to pursue their policy goals.
Eric, thank you very much.
Sure.